A young man travels abroad to an exotic location. Upon his return, he finds that all is not as it should be. And thus, we are introduced to tonight's story. This is the second story I've read, written by Cage Venom, and it's quite an interesting one. Now, for those of you who've missed out on the first story, I've tagged it on to the end of this video, so my apologies in advance to all those of you who've heard the story in the second part, but if you haven't, it's well worth listening. So, 40 minutes of sensory delight for you this evening, my dear friends. Well, you know what time it is. It's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink and listen. Are you absolutely positive you locked the door when you left? Denise's voice was too desperate for her words to be an accusation. More like a plea. I adjusted the phone in my hand and the collar of my shirt. Yes, absolutely. I went back up and checked. The latter was a lie, but I was quite sure I'd locked the apartment when I left on Friday. No answer for a few long seconds. We think someone might have broken in. Her voice was rife with dread. The thought didn't fully register, and I was too surprised to speak. The line was quiet for a minute. Then she spoke again. Gale and I, there were footprints. His stuff was messed up. Gale's, that is. We'll figure it out when I get there. Well, put simply, in the end, we didn't really. I got there about 2 hours later. It was a bit before 11 in the evening. Gale and Denise looked all right. They were a bit tired. The worry over what happened had somewhat dissipated by then, but they were still quieter than usual. I briefly tried to lift the mood, unsuccessfully. Nothing seemed to come of the whole thing in the following days. We hadn't found anything missing, and no other concrete evidence of an actual break-in. One might think we'd live in fear after that, but without a constant reminder, we didn't get the chance to really commit the whole ordeal to memory. Sure, I was even more careful about locking the door whenever I left, but that was mostly to ensure neither of them would be given a reason to doubt me. The thing finally up and vanished from our minds when Gale collapsed one day while cooking himself some lunch. Hearing the loud crash, I dashed to the kitchen and found him lying on the floor. Rushing to Gale's side took me 2, maybe 3 seconds, but my mind still seemed to have time to tumble through half a dozen thoughts. I'd never seen a person collapse like this before. And though I'd been taught what to do in these situations, I didn't feel in control, not by a long shot. It was my own voice, shouting Gale's name, which blew back the fog machine's work on my mind. Gale. I sounded calmer than I'd anticipated. Gale, what's wrong? I was about to gently smack his face when he blinked and looked at me. Did I collapse? He asked. I nodded. Are you okay, man? You scared the shit out of me. I don't know. I don't feel weird or anything. He rechecks his explanation by pondering for a short while, considering whether or not he really is okay. I offer him my hand and pick him up. I'm relieved to see he can still stand. It takes him a good long second to start laughing. Gale had a weird and, what I think is kind of childish, tendency to find serious stuff that somehow ended all right to be funny. His unwavering optimism would come, sometimes, dangerously close to naivety, but in the moment it was infectious. I laughed nervously. Man, the exams aren't even starting and you're already passing out on me. Then I added, the weight of the concern dropping my voice about half an octave. You really should head to bed and kick back. I was preaching to the choir, though. He was already in his half of our room, climbing into bed. He chuckled slightly and said yes, apparently feeling the need to belay my fears. His success was limited. He'd forgotten to stop the water, which ran through the leaves of a head of lettuce. I closed the tap and stared at the few brown dots, stretching like veins, reaching for the sinkhole. I started to worry about Gale. People don't just collapse, right? This question was the seed, and growing from it was a stem of possible reasons. Gale had just returned from a trip to Africa, where he'd spent a whole month working part-time at a laboratory. He got the relevant shots before going down there, but what if it was something else? A couple of years ago, in high school, we were privy to a slideshow of downright nightmarish afflictions one could pick up in Africa. I remember one called river blindness most vividly. A parasite worm that lives, feeds, and breeds inside your eyes. Apart from that wonderful nugget, my knowledge of diseases indigenous to Africa was very limited. My ignorance was anything but bliss. Rather, it was simply negative space to fill with terrifying possibilities. Gale woke up a couple of hours later with eyes as glassy as marbles. He was sick. I brought him a glass of water and pelted him with questions about what could have caused it. He didn't mind me asking, but he didn't seem to have any idea about the origin of his sudden illness either. On Friday, I decided to stay with him over the weekend to make sure he's all right. We usually went back home at the weekend, since it was a 2-hour drive home. That was the day his fever peaked. Man, I could feed you brownie batter and it'd cook by the time it got to your stomach, was my answer when he announced his temperature. That night, I stayed up late doing homework, when Gale decided it was time to scare my very soul straight out of me by talking in his sleep. He did that sometimes, and it's usually most akin to listening to Gale's side of a telephone conversation with his mother. Without exception, I'd forgotten everything he'd ever said in his sleep up to that point. After endangering the cleanliness of my underwear, he took a pause, drawing air slowly and calmly again. I chuckled to myself and rolled my eyes slightly. He and Denise would surely find the story hilarious in the morning. Then he spoke up again, and the pitch of his voice was higher, and he mumbled quickly. He sounded like he was resisting something. Hearing it made me uneasy. It was like watching a typical bullying scene from a movie. The sound lagging behind or staying just ahead of the picture. In that tender state of mind, which seems to result from staying awake past one's bedtime, I felt disturbed. To my utter relief, his fever fell a bit the following day. This was reason enough for me to convince him to let me take him to the doctor. Our best bet was the hospital, but neither of us had a car, so we had to take the bus. After an hour of being crammed in a sweaty bus, whose driver had decided that the summer had ended and air conditioning was no longer needed, in spite of the blazing heat outside, we had to wait another 30 minutes before we could go in. The trip back was even less fun, especially because of the dissatisfying, "It's probably nothing," Gale had gotten as his diagnosis. His fever was back, eyes bloodshot and glossy, and he even had to lean on me for support as we returned home. I felt tired, walking back from the station. That was the first time I saw a certain white van parked outside of our apartment block. That same van, recognizable by a red eye logo of some sort, found a different parking spot in our street every single day from then on. whenever I walked past it, on my way to college or to the store. I would see the driver shamelessly staring at me. From what I could see, he was a man in his 40s, possibly 50s, with dark, round eyes set deep into his face. They followed me like two black camera lenses. A TV company, no doubt scamming grandmothers and installing satellite dishes to spite the digital age and turn a short-term investment. Well, or so I thought. I took it up with Denise, who said at first she hadn't noticed. She came back to me, totally creeped out, later that same day, saying she had seen the van and the guy. In the middle of the week, I found one of Gail's potted plants had been completely destroyed. Only a few green bits poking out of the dirt. He avoided the question when I asked him. Then, something else happened. It must have been Friday, or at least Thursday, because Denise was already gone for the weekend. I decided to stay with Gail again. I was awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of the front door being unlocked. I checked the time on my phone. 2:30. Was Denise coming back this late? Why? And why was she struggling with the lock so much? I decided to let her in and ask her why she'd come back and why she was so late. "Denise, hang on, I'll get it for you," I said. The clicking noise stopped immediately and was followed by a short silence. Then, footsteps, at least 2 sets, rapidly receding away from the door. I unlocked the door, threw it open and looked outside, but I had taken too long. The culprits were already behind the corner and stomping down the stairs full speed. I considered giving chase, but decided against it. There were at least 2 after all, and I was in my underwear. Instead, I immediately took my phone and called the police. Another first for me. All of these things were happening within the space of 2 weeks. What the hell was going on? With that taken into account, I think I did a decent job of keeping my calm on the phone. They told me that they'd send someone over, and I thanked them before setting the phone down. "What's going on?" came Gail's weak voice from behind the door. I poked my head into our room and slowly told him that I thought someone was trying to break in and that I'd called the cops. In what little light the crack in the door offered, I could see his shocked expression. "What?" he asked. Someone was fiddling with the lock, I think. They ran away before I could open up to see them. I called the police. They'll come soon. You should stay in bed, though." Gail seemed to disagree, but was unable to get out of bed anyway. He looked terrible, as pale as a snowman, wrapped in blankets to stop him shivering. He was sweating like a snowman too, by the looks of it. Hair clung to his forehead in wet ribbons, and I could even see the occasional sparkle of droplets of perspiration on his face. The policeman took about 30 minutes, all of which I spent pacing between the hallway and kitchen, checking the entrance and the window. By the time he arrived, much of my energy, supplemented by the adrenaline rush, was gone. I got worried that I'd just dreamed the whole thing up. The embarrassing thought crept into my mind just as I was explaining what had happened. When I finished, he asked me a few things. Then we went through it again. The conversation took over half an hour, and by the time it ended, I felt like I'd just been to an oral exam and failed miserably. I worked up the courage and asked him about what would happen now. He took a second before answering. Choosing his words, I think, put my mind at ease. From what I can gather, this was probably a one-time deal. Break-ins are quite rare around here. He seemed to cut away a bit of the formality at that point, and I remember appreciating it greatly. Look, most of the times we get called in for attempted burglaries, we're not called again. What I mean is, Someone who got caught in the act is really unlikely to do it at the same spot, he said. This managed to calm me down. I thanked the officer kindly, and he told me not to hesitate to call again. A day of being a zombie awaited me, so I quickly checked on Gale before hitting the hay. After that, we only got 3 or so full nights of sleep, and even there I should speak for myself, because my roommate was still very ill. I cooked him a few meals, but he mostly got by on salt sticks. His appetite was abysmal. As if that wasn't enough, I found another one of his plants had been vandalized, and a piece of leaf was missing from a third. Denise returned on Sunday. That night I was awakened by the sound of Gale coughing and choking on something. I jumped up and immediately ran to him, slapping on the light, asking what was wrong. He was holding his throat and thrashing around in bed. He freed himself from the blanket and fell to the floor. "Gale, shit, what's going on?" No answer, and the coughing noises stopped. I pulled him up by the waist using both of my arms. He doesn't resist, but he's not helping either. I managed to get him to stand, bent over. I hit him on the back 5 times. Nothing. "Denise, help!" I'd cry at the top of my lungs. I started with the abdominal thrusts. There was a small noise in his throat each time I pushed. Denise came rushing into the room. "Oh my God," she cried, but I cut her off. "Call 911, he's choking." Denise stood there in a daze for a second, hand over her mouth. She stared at Gale, hanging limply from my arms. "Now, Denise," I shouted again, shocking her out of her trance. Denise scurried to her room, and I could hear her talking into the phone. Gale started to shake and convulse, freeing himself from my grip and falling to the floor. The floor stayed still, but the walls spun around a little when I saw Gale lying on the floor on his side. A vine hung out of his mouth. Wet leaves covered with vomit were piled next to his face, the sour-smelling liquid pooling out from underneath him. Darkness advanced from the corners of my vision, threatening to make me faint at any second. I bent down to Gale, my chin stuck to my chest, looking up at him sideways. Strong nausea gripped my stomach and the back of my tongue. I pulled on the vine, but it was slippery, forcing me to spool it around my hand to get a better grip. I pulled on it again, moving it a good 10 centimeters. Gale gagged and more thick fluid came out of his mouth. There were undigested bits of leaves, not attached to the vine, too. I grit my teeth harder, wondering how much longer I could do this for. That's when the paramedics stormed in. Denise led them into the room, and they shoved me out of the way. I immediately ran to the toilet and emptied my stomach. I then got up, washed my hands and my face thoroughly, feeling incredibly lightheaded. Gale was already on the stretcher, and the men were carrying him outside. A weird thought occurred to me then. In my dizziness, one of the paramedics seemed familiar for some reason, but I couldn't pinpoint it exactly. I thought I almost had it, but couldn't remember at all. 10 minutes later, a loud siren announced an ambulance pulling into the street. Every blare it made sent a chill down my spine. I dashed to the window. The ambulance stopped in the middle of the road and 2 people jumped out of the back. I watched in horror as the figures went through the entrance of our apartment block. The paramedic I'd recognized carrying Gale away earlier was the one from the van that had been watching us. Denise held a confused conversation with the real paramedics while I dialed the police, sitting on the floor under the window. Denise and I spent the rest of the night at the police station, sleeping on the waiting chairs after answering God knows how many questions. There's been no news of Gail's whereabouts since. Denise and I were told to move out of the apartment, and neither of us complained one bit. Things have gone quiet. It's been a year now. It seems like a terrible dream, looking back at it now. The only thing maintaining my faith is the fact that Denise saw it too. I know, because I don't know how many times I've asked her. Out of fear of what might happen, I've kept quiet about this up to this point. And while I'd like to say I've finally overcome this fear, that would be a lie. In fact, fear is the main reason why I'm writing this. You see, you have to understand. There's been a white van with a red eye parked outside of my place for the past 3 days. Welcome back, my dear friends. I hope you had a fantastic weekend. Now, last week I indulged you with a very long story. Tonight's isn't quite so long, but I can guarantee by the end of it, you're all going to be thinking to yourself, what the hell have I just listened to? Quite a story in store for you this evening. Well, my dear friends, without further ado, it's time to sit back and relax with your favorite drink. And listen. Ellie's eyes fluttered open, only to be blasted by strong white light. Her arms shot up and hid her face from the glare, as she slowly became able to see her surroundings. She was stuck in a plexiglass cube, big enough for her 13-year-old self to stretch out her arms and barely be able to lay down both palms of her hands on opposite walls. The material was transparent, and through it, Ellie could clearly see that her cube cage was somehow stuck to the center of a square wall, about 5 feet off the ground. The room was a brilliant white color. Marble tiles decorated the floors, and a very strong light was coming from a simple white luminaire hanging from the center of the ceiling. It was shaped rectangularly, as the wall opposite to the one Ellie's box was mounted on was much further than the ones to the side. That wall had a white door with a silver knob in the center. There was a desk at the half point between her box and the door, offset towards the wall on Ellie's right-hand side, though she couldn't see a chair behind it. A black fountain pen with a golden nib resting on a black, round holder, and a white clipboard with blank papers were the only things on the table, which seemed to be made of white, glossy plastic. Next to the table, and below the light hanging from above, stood a person. He was tall enough to meet Ellie's eyes without her looking down. The slenderness of his body was emphasized by the black buttons, creating a dotted line from his neck to his white pants and plain black shoes. His face, as if floating in the whiteness, was framed by a curled cloud of thick black hair. His most striking feature were his blood-red eyes, staring motionlessly, unblinkingly at Ellie. The man's face was expressionless. Ellie, startled, knocked on the translucent wall, trying to get the man's attention, but to no avail. She felt the claws of fear and panic slowly climbing up her stomach, weaving spiderwebs in her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her fear rose like the mercury in a thermometer sunken into hot water. She heard a metallic humming noise of something running through pipes from behind her, followed by a splash. She quickly veered her head around to find the source. Water was pouring onto the floor, the pressure making the glass-looking jet come down just shy of the center of the bottom panel. It soaked into her skirt and got into her shoes before she could get up on her knees. Her face was now in the tight grip of terror as she slammed her palms against the window, desperately screaming for help. The man stood, unmoved. The transparent liquid pooled about a centimeter deep at the bottom of the cube, and it looked as if it was the bottom panel expanding upwards. Ellie had given up on this staring man and looked for a way out. She shoved at the top panel with all her might, then pressed her back against one side and pushed at the other with her feet. It didn't budge. The cube was over a quarter full by now, the water level well above Ellie's waist. The little girl's clothes were soaked now, clinging to her body. She reassumed her position on her knees, once more pleading with the motionless man. Her cries became high-pitched as the cold fluid slowly crawled its way up her thighs, unsticking the bottom of her skirt from her body, making it float. Tears viciously poured down her cheeks as her cries for help turned to sobs. Soon she was on her feet, her palms pressed against the top window, the liquid up to her neck. Her silent crying occasionally turned to loud wails of mixed horror and anger, but subsided whenever her chin touched the liquid, and the paralyzing fear of drowning repossessed her body. As the last 2 centimeters of the cube were filled, Ellie took one last deep breath and went under. She looked through the front panel, but could barely see 2 black specks. One was the penholder on the table. The other was the man's hair. She hit the glass again, a few precious air bubbles escaping her lips. Her chest began to hurt from holding in the air. She placed her hands over her lips, desperately trying to keep the air in. Her palms slowly moved to her throat. She couldn't take it anymore. The need to exhale was like a hot iron stuck in her head. Exhale. The air had to be pushed out. Ellie hit the glass. A bouquet of bubbles erupted from Ellie's mouth. The silver flowers of her last breath floated to the top of the cube and were slowly sucked out by unseen tubes. Ellie took a breath of the fluid and immediately started to cough it out, a few more sparkles escaping her lips. And then her world faded to black. The black-haired man stood and watched as her lifeless body floated in the liquid. Her hair fanned out like a curtain, crowning her head with the dark chestnut color. She looked as if she was caught in a giant ice cube that had very sharp edges. Her face wasn't contorted with pain or screaming anymore. It was peaceful now. Ellie's eyes shot open, her entire body flinching. She was lying in the soft embrace of a bed, the covers pulled up to her neck. It was so delightfully dry and warm that even in her panic state, she was able to appreciate the comfort it offered. Just then, a figure leaned over and into view, causing Ellie to let out a frightened gasp. It was the man, the one who'd watched her drown. Except... "Hello, Ellie." His blue eyes sparkled with a calm kindness. "Where am I?" she asked, trembling with fear. Even if he did hear the question, his features didn't show it. Am I dead?" Ellie stuttered on. At this, the man's clean-shaven face softened into a smile. "Oh," she said, looking somewhat disappointed, and only slightly less weary. She eyed the man very carefully. "Are you God?" The man's smile remained motionless. Ellie took it as a yes, but investigated further. "But you look just like that terrible person who... Well, I told him to help me, but he just stood there and then there was all this water, and then I think I drowned." "Oh?" asked the man, with a voice which was perhaps a bit too smooth. She'd always imagined God as having an angry, roaring voice, like the one her mother imitated whenever she read Bible stories to Ellie before bed. The story about Moses, at least her mother's rendition of it, was her favourite. "Yes, his eyes were different, but you look just like him." The man answered, his eyes now focusing on Ellie's. "What?" "I always look like the last person you saw during your life. Did you not like the person who looks like me?" In spite of everything, Ellie was nearly convinced. She remembered how she'd drowned in that see-through cell after all. "Can you prove it? Can you prove you're God?" The man then curiously raised his eyebrows, and then went back to smiling. He motioned for Ellie to sit up. She did so, and now was able to see around the room. She was lying in a four-poster queen bed with white wood posts. The sheets were white with detailed floral designs. The carpet was white, and so was a chest of drawers up against the wall across from Ellie. There was an open window to the left, and white silken curtains were swaying gently in the wind. Beyond it, Ellie only saw bright light. There were no doors anywhere in the room. The man was sitting next to her on the bed. His arm was now outstretched, fingers limply pointing at the chest of drawers. The palm of his hand slowly rose, and with it, the piece of furniture. It stopped 3 feet off the ground, before he gently set it down again. Ellie tried to stifle a "whoa," but failed, feeling like a little kid for doing so. She fell into silence, her mind trying to comprehend everything that had happened. "So this is heaven, then?" she finally asked. "Not quite," answered the blue-eyed man. "We'll talk about that a little later, though. Now, we should talk about you." The two spun a long thread of conversation, and Ellie told him all about her life. They talked about her family. Ellie loved her parents and her brother dearly. She admired her father for being so knowledgeable, but also confessed that she was sad whenever he was too engrossed in his work to listen to her. They talked about school. Ellie did pretty well academically, but she felt quite at odds with most of the other girls. She didn't give much thought to the boys, unless they purposefully nagged her. Even then, she would usually ignore them, and they would give up eventually. Ellie had few friends. Throughout her schooling, she'd always stuck around one person most of the time. though that person changed every 2 years or so. She would still maintain good relationships with most of the girls that had been her friends like that, but not all of them. They talked about Aisha, her best friend at the time. She and Ellie shared what they thought was a unique craziness, which would only come out when they were at home, one visiting the other. They would put up shows to an imaginary audience, which would, invariably, end with both of them rolling on the floor with laughter, barely breathing. Aisha had that one music band that she'd always listened to. Ellie noted that she was slowly warming up to them, having already learned 2 of the songs by heart. Aisha lived on the internet, her mobile phone constantly chirping with notifications whenever the 2 of them were together. They would often read through them and answer strangers on the net, giggling at how witty their responses must have been. They talked about books, which Ellie thought was kind of funny. She'd read a lot of books up to the age of 10 or so, but then sort of stopped. It had fallen out of fashion, and though she'd always advocate books, she wouldn't really read them all that much as of late. She'd just finished explaining that, although she liked romance, fantasy was her favorite genre, when the man interrupted her by saying, "Excuse me, Ellie, but are you hungry by any chance?" Ellie's stomach had been rumbling for a while now, but she hadn't noticed as she'd been immersed in the conversation. "Yes," she simply answered, hiding her embarrassment. "Good. How does apple pie sound?" the man said in a soft tone. "That's my favorite," Ellie said, momentarily touched. "How did you know?" The man simply smiled in response, opened the bedside cupboard and pulled out a hot pan of apple pie, a plate, and some utensils. He cut out a piece and handed it to her on the plate, watching her as she hungrily devoured the delicious treat. "Oh, excuse me, would you also like some?" she asked, halfway through her piece, her eyes practically begging him to say no. "That's very kind of you, but I'm quite all right," said the man, still smiling. He patted her head and sat back down on the side of the bed. Quite some time had passed since Ellie had awoken. "Ellie, may I ask you another question?" "Yes," answered Ellie, her mouth full, a crumb of pie rolling out and somewhere between the sheets. Her eyes frantically searched for it on the bed around her, and when they found nothing, she turned back to the man, trying to look as inconspicuous as possible. "Before I take you to heaven, I can give you another shot at life, if you'd like." Ellie cocked her head to the side, expecting an explanation. "If you go to heaven with me, you won't see Mommy, Daddy, your little brother, or Aisha for a very long time. But if you go back, you might see them again. You might live out your life, and the next time we meet could look different. I might look like your future husband, or one of your children, if you have either of those." Each of the words nudged at Ellie, making rips in her current peaceful mood. She wanted to see her parents. She was pretty sure she would have liked to have lived a longer life. Her eyes welled up. "Can you do it?" she asked in a strangled voice. That smile. Again. "Please, do it then," she said, her head sinking. The blue-eyed man pulled a small silver box from his pocket. He opened it and got out a syringe of clear liquid. He flicked it gently, then squirted some out of the needle. He started lowering himself towards Ellie. "This will help you calm down. Then You'll wake up back in the real world. He squeezed the contents into her arm. Ellie started to feel dizzy almost immediately. He set the syringe down on the cupboard and gently held Ellie's hand until her world went dark again. James Knight got up from the bed, only taking a second to admire his handiwork. His hand slipped into his pocket, pulling out another box, this one smaller and grey in colour. He took out a red contact lens and gently placed it into his left eye. Then he did the same for his right eye. Then he produced a tissue from the same pocket and wiped the small droplet of blood that had gathered on Ellie's arm where he'd injected her. The red-eyed man gathered the girl in his arms and carried her down to the office. He jumped up on a stepladder and gently placed Ellie into the clear glass cube, which was again empty of the liquid, its top side opened like a lid. He closed the lid and locked it into place by pressing it down. Then he carried the stepladder out of the room, came back in, and closed the door behind him. James watched, completely still, as Ellie woke up. He watched Ellie scream and beg for his help. He watched the absolute horror in her eyes when the perfluorodecolin again began to pour into the box. It wasn't water pouring in, but rather a breathable liquid. It wouldn't really drown her, since she could still breathe while submerged. But Ellie didn't know that. Ellie couldn't have known that. And so he watched, yet again without expression, as her air ran out, and Ellie drowned again. Well, I told you that was a weird one, didn't I? What was his game? What was he up to? What was his big plan? I'd love to have your thoughts on the matter because, honestly, I can't work it out at all. Well, that's it for me for this evening. Hopefully I'll see you all again real soon. But for now, bye-bye.